Well, my name is Kevin Barron. I am a journalist, an analyst, a longtime Washington denizen. I've been covering foreign policy, defense, and security for, 25 years. So it's a pleasure for me to be here to help explain to you the Trump victory in the United States, what it means for anything after January starts, in particular what it means for the chances for multilateral reforms. We've heard a lot of that today. I've heard a lot of that today. A lot of the calls and ambitions for what might come next. We're shortly following a G20 meeting. We have a lot of meetings on the horizon to come. And so our goal is to have some fun tonight, to be a little lighthearted, to be a little quick on our thoughts, and to welcome you into the conversation. We can always wait till the end for questions, but we prefer to have a little bit of interaction. So if you hear something that catches your ear, raise your hand, try to flag me, come to one of these side microphones there. I'll be sure to call on you, and we'll get things started. A couple of thoughts I had. You know, this conference, I've heard a few things. I've heard a lot of frustrations. Frustrations at the existing world order created by the North in 1945 has been invoked quite a lot. Frustrations at the global South for not being able to change it, for having too many differences or a little inertia to change it. Frustrations at everyone in between for not having enough speed to get to those changes. I've heard a lot of calls that, frankly, I've heard for about 25 years, UN reform, for example. These are not new ideas necessarily, but there is definitely new traction, and this is a new era. So there might be a lot of hope to be had from the global South in the changes that have come in the year's elections, correct? I think, though, as an American journalist, what I don't hear back home is the same conversation. And so I'm curious to know how people in this panel and this audience think you can penetrate that conversation. It exists, but it exists in the same way that I think of these security conferences or foreign policy conferences as, you know, these are specialists. We are specialists in the room, and our jobs are usually to educate the wider publics, to educate the leaders to what we think needs to be changed, what you think, what policies, what changes, what futures need to exist. The same way a conference of doctors would say so about medical futures, or teachers, or any other profession. So do your best to explain to the world what you think the Trump administration, the Trump victory coming back into a new administration means, both for perhaps your country, your perspective, and the future of multilateral reforms. And Sarah, we'll turn to you as our South African representative. You get to represent the entire nation, and tell us your opinion of what just happened and what might come.
All right. So I think, you know, firstly, Samir and team, fantastic work. But one of the things that I was worried about was the timing of this session. And then I thought, of course the US is awake. Of course we're in conversation with the US. So this is why we're having this time to have this conversation about Trump, right? So that's the first thing. The second thing that I think we need to appreciate is this. That in the US there were elections. There was no coup in the US. The majority of US citizens voted for Trump, or for a political party that Trump leads. So I think we need to appreciate that, because if we were to personalize what's happening in the US, we are missing the point that there were elections, and the majority of people in the US want a particular administration, and it's a Trump administration. Secondly, I think Politics 101 will also tell us that we can also personalize these things. It can't be just a Trump administration. It's a U.S. administration, and therefore the policies of the U.S. are going to lead the day in many ways. And we've dealt with something similar in South Africa, if you like, when suddenly in Brazil there was a particular regime that came into place, and we were very nervous about that regime, and that regime is now gone. But with this particular regime, we don't know what's happening. Let me bring it home to South Africa and to Africa in particular. I think what we fail to maybe at this point analyze is that any any repatriation from the U.S. to anywhere, whether it's Mexico or even in the continent, has a serious implications for the economy of the continent. Practical terms, remittances. Our remittances in the value of remittances from the U.S. to the continent. Should anything happen there with the building of walls or people being moved out of the U.S., I think has an important negative impact. However, these are complex matters. These are complex matters that require particular strategies. In South Africa, for example, we talk about the role of AGOA. So whatever we want to say about the US, we also need to take the complexity of AGOA into consideration, because yes, we can indeed criticize, and I'm sure most of us want to criticize the US regime and a particular president, but let's consider the economies of Africa. The advantage that we have with whatever issues that might happen in the US, or the instability that other people are predicting around the US, has potential positives for us in South Africa, in Africa, and in the global South, particularly in BRICS. South Africa and Africa, we have a trade agreement that still needs to see the light of day, fully so. So any issues in the US might be a potential for that to happen. For BRICS and the global South, the idea of consolidation is more real now with the change in regime in the US. I think this time requires us to be very strategic and not fall into the traps of rhetoric and criticizing for the sake of criticizing and not thinking about sustainable development. Thanks.
Well, thanks. That's a good start. Rachel, you're our transatlantic voice on the panel, right? Coming from your perspective. And Samir wanted us to get to the Americans before he had his chance to chime in. I think that's just a strategic delay on his part. but you know, give me your perspective as a transatlanticist on this notion of multilateral reform. Again, we just had the G20 meeting. Trump has nominated for the defense secretary Pete Hegseth, and in the last 24 hours it's come out, he's previously written that he wants to blow up NATO, that NATO is an archaic institution that needs to be wiped away and something new started. These are major reforms. These are structural reforms that we didn't hear from the Biden administration, for better or for worse, but are these opportunities? Are these dangers? What should the world expect next?
Okay, so this is fun because I get to channel my inner Trump for the next few minutes. No, but speaking seriously through the lens of multilateralism, I look at this focusing on both the EU and NATO. And the reality is, we're not actually 100% sure what Trump's approach to his presidency is going to be. We have a blueprint from last time. We have a lot of his comments. We have some of the people that he's chosen for key administrative posts already. Looking at what he said about the EU, for example, he thinks that it was created to economically undermine the United States. In terms of NATO, he thinks that the United States is the country that gets the least out of its membership. And so that kind of gives us a sense of guiding factors in terms of how Trump thinks not just about European multilateral institutions, but multilateral institutions in general. What is the US getting out of these? What can these countries do for the United States? That's kind of the general vibe of the way he does things. What's interesting in the United States, contrary to popular belief, the tent of people is actually wider now that are willing to go in and work for a Trump administration. That doesn't mean he's opening the tent to people that might have been never Trumpers before, but there are more people now that he is no longer a fringe candidate. He is now the Republican Party. He's very much a mainstream political figure at this point. That means the means by which Trump and his administration can carry out their policies are going to be more targeted and essentially more effective. And that could be a good thing or a bad thing. Trump is not an isolationist. I think that's the wrong word for him. I think he's a unilateralist. I think he's a transactionalist. But isolationism is not, I think, the right word to describe him. And this means a few things for certain institutions and partners abroad. First, I think it means that the understanding in Europe needs to be that this is no longer the region that is going to geopolitically orient the United States. His focus is going to be on the Indo-Pacific, but that also means I think there are more opportunities here for the global South. I always say that President Biden is America's last truly transatlantic president because he was reared in the Cold War era, and there is, I think, a generational shift that's happening in the United States that's reorienting American foreign policy. I also think it means that partners and allies need to come to the table with offers. For Europe, this means things like higher defense spending, potentially a joint EU approach on China, increased funding and support for Ukraine. But I don't necessarily think that multilateralism is dead under a Trump presidency, but it's going to be interesting to see how he plays these specific cards.
Well, a lot of what you're talking about is, I heard you mention Biden is maybe the last transatlantic, president. I said a lot in the last year, so I think especially following the October 7th attacks in Israel, that we're seeing an emergence of a reaction to events like these globally that are new in the sense that they don't care about the old rules of the world order. They don't care about the borders as much. They don't care about even agreements, treaties. They care about other issues that are trends that may blow right through those things, whether it's justice, whether it's independent thinking, whether it's something other than democracy. There's something going on worldwide where the old rules of states perhaps are not as strong or as reliable as they used to be. Glad I'll bring it to you, coming from your institute. It might be easier for you to channel your inner Trump than it was for Rachel, but tell us the leading question: what does the Trump victory mean for the chances of multilateral reforms?
Well, you're right. You're right. I was living in Texas for a while, but for the last 3 years, I've been living in Hungary because Texas wasn't quite pro-Trump enough for me. So I picked the the most pro-Trump country in Europe is Hungary. So it's definitely an interesting time. Yes. But look, for the last 8 years, people have been debating whether the first Trump administration was politically significant and geopolitically significant. Basically, whether it meant something. And I think that the mandate that Trump came back with this time is a clear indication that it wasn't simply an exception to the long-term growth of the liberal world order, liberal international order, but maybe actually that the liberal international order was a kind of exception for the 30 years in which it was very effective and operating well. So I think the period that we're entering into now is a kind of interregnum. It's clear that Trump and the critiques of the liberal international order that he brought are shared by a lot of people, certainly outside of the Western system. They're shared very broadly, and those critiques haven't yet formulated or brought something new into existence. Right now, we're in something like the battle of the zombies, where I won't name names about what institutions should be considered zombies or not, but I'll name a few concepts that should be considered zombie concepts. So neoliberal economic policy is something like a zombie. There are many institutions that were built up around it. It has been kind of failing or on life support since the 2008 financial crisis. People no longer believe, even in Europe, that it will bring economic prosperity, and yet there's a huge intellectual and institutional architecture built around it. What comes after that? Well, no one seems to know yet. It's still there. It's kind of a zombie. You have to battle with it. In foreign policy, there has also been a similar problem. In the US, the neoconservative foreign policy that was very prominent after the end of the Cold War and throughout the last 20 years had a huge impact. It dictated the US foreign policy across many different theaters for a long time, motivated by the vision that military force would spread liberal democracy, which people were just waiting to accept. The critique of this came actually within the US, and the first Trump election was a big part of it. US soldiers and their families had become disillusioned by the promises that were made during the early part of the 21st century, to which they contributed their lives and their treasure. And there was a huge backlash against this, even within the Republican Party, from ordinary voters and ordinary patriotic Americans. What does that mean in terms of the international institutions that are associated with it? That's a question that hasn't been answered yet. But there are a lot of voices and themes and trends that are still trying to keep the old foreign policy alive. So is NATO a zombie institution? Well, no, I definitely wouldn't say that. Certainly we would never say that in Hungary, where it's a key guarantor of our national security. Nevertheless, there is a kind of conceptual battle going on around it. Is NATO a defensive alliance? Is it supposed to project itself into every part of the world? Is it going to be a global peacekeeping force? Should everyone join it? These are still questions about which there's a battle. So the battle around those questions is going to heighten a lot in the next 4 years. And I think we'll see a much more earnest resolution of that than we did previously. In 2016, it was easy to say that Trump was a kind of exception. Biden was going to be the return to normalcy, quote unquote. People saw what normalcy supposedly looked like. It ended up being a much more chaotic world. And that, I think, is why many people, surprisingly throughout the world, are more optimistic about what a Trump administration would allow them to deal with than they have been in the last 4 years. So that's what I see now.
Thanks for those thoughts. It puts some good perspective on thinking forward. How much will the next Trump administration look like the last? In the last time, he said things like, and people thought he was going to end NATO and blow it up and start something new. Turns out he didn't. He had a lot of ambitions that were dialed back either by the people around him or just by himself, and so people are trying to read the tea leaves, as we're doing here tonight, of does Trump mean what he say? Will his advisors let him do what he said he wanted to do? And what the end result will look like. Samir, now's your big chance. You've heard the opening remarks. My thoughts are, with Trump's election and the rest of the elections around the world that we've seen, are these opportunities, is there an opportunity for a greater chance or a lesser chance for multilateral reforms?
You know, in a paradoxical way, Trump's election is the beginning of the reform of the multilateral system. And let me explain why. Multilateralism, until now, was a fairy tale. La La Land.
Why?
Let's save the planet. Let's feed the poor. Let's make everyone equal. Let's put money into everyone's pocket. Never happened. It was fairy tales. Fairy tales were sold to all parts of the world by the neoliberal economic promise post 1990 or 1991, when Pax Americana became true, and when literally Europe signed on to the American project in a wholesome manner. That multilateralism was false. It was fake. It destroyed the planet. It kept people poor. It created strife. And it was, in many ways, hypocritical by its very design, in its very design. That multilateralism, perhaps, is now over. Trump's election will make us all real on what to expect from the big powers, from the institutions that they man, from the banks that they control, and from the militaries that they, in some ways, fund and support. So I think multilateralism is going to get real, and in some ways, the reform has begun. We know what to expect from the US without having to be lectured by them on what the right way of living is. We heard lectures. We did not hear anything else from multilateral institutions until now. In my living life, I have seen promises from each of these institutions, and none of them have been fulfilled. We will all have to now, I wrote a piece some time back, we will all have to now engage in something what I called multilateralism that is defined through the legal architecture of limited liability partnerships, We will have to invest into groups and into institutions where there is common purpose, common direction, and common interest. This values framework that was basically used to subdue expression and interest of many other parts of the world, and that was in many ways the cutting edge, or rather the single most important attribute of the old system, is over. Interests are on the table, and negotiations can be now truer in that sense. So that's the first point. I think multilateralism is going to be real, it's going to be interest-based, and it is going to see folks enter into sometimes transactional relationships, sometimes longer-term interest-based relationships, and sometimes ideological relationships. You're going to have all three of them. It's not going to be 1, 2, or 3. It's going to be all of them, right? So that's the first point. The second, there is nothing that we have seen in Trump 1.0 that was not carried forward by the Biden administration when it comes to international relations, foreign policy, and global engagement of the US. Nothing that Trump did was actually discontinued by the Biden administration. Make America Great Again, which was a nationalist industrial policy, became Inflation Reduction Act, nationalist industrial policy. Bring employment and bring industry back to America. Very smart words, same ruthless transactional American sentiments, right? The second, so Trump 1.0, Biden only 1.0, and Trump 2 are likely to be part of the same continuum of how America has changed as a country, and like Gladden mentioned and Rachel mentioned, it's changed fundamentally, and that change is going to be in many ways reflected in Trump 2.0. There's nothing going to be so shocking and surprising for everyone. The second, he is a disruptor, but his disruption is going to shake the elites, those who are sitting on pots of money and on real estate of power. The aspirants all over the world and in the US are going to sense an opportunity here, that if they are nimble, agile, clever, they can actually build space for themselves. There is an opportunity here for those who are outside of the traditional order and the traditional ruling elite to actually find space for themselves. And I think that's the second thing that is going to happen, that Trump 2.0 is going to actually be celebrated in certain parts of the world. I spend a lot of time in the Middle East, in South Asia, in this continent, and I can tell you that people here are not as worried about the Trump presidency as the Americans are, and the people here are also not so worried about American democracy as the Americans are. They actually, this time around, saw an election that was decisive, an election where, in many ways, all comers from different demographic segments of the American population did vote for it. You can quibble about the numbers and the percentages, but the fact is, it was an election where you saw the bulk of America reveal itself and choose a leader. You may like him or you may dislike him, but he represents the US now, and you will have to do business with him. You have a clear, decisive mandate in a person that the world will have to deal with. So I think what has happened in the US has closed three things. Three big changes have happened with the selection of Trump. It's finally put to rest the Clinton dynasty. It has disrupted the beginnings of the Obama dynasty. And it has, in many ways, made the Republican Party the Trump Party. So now, the last time around, Trump defeated the Republican Party and the Democratic Party to become the president. This time, he had to defeat these two dynasties and the Democratic Party to win the election. I think that is really what has happened. It's the end of the Obama era, end of the Clinton era. Democrats will have to reinvent themselves if they have to, come back and be relevant again to a very new America.
It's also the end of the Bush era. You left those out. I see your two fingers. I just wanted to say, it's what I'm hearing. To summarize, if Trump is shaking the tree and causing a whole new set of opportunities, you sound excited that if you're a nation who is who is nimble and agile, as you said, enough to take advantage of that, you can. But that sounds to me like also a bit of a free market, Wild West approach to international relations. That sounds great if you're able to take advantage of it, but what if you're not able? That sounds maybe far less equitable than the previous system. And so, Sarah, I saw you nodding a lot first. If you had reactions, and then I want to turn to Rachel.
Yeah, I think it depends which part, how close you are to the U.S. If you think that the world is round, then Africa is has a different view from what from Samir's side what India has to say. The fact of the matter is that and this is where I'm in agreement. It's still the U.S. It's still the U.S. and whether it's Trump or it's Biden or it's Obama or it's Bush for the continent, it has always been the same, right? And India now stands to benefit the most with the chaos inside the U.S. as compared to the continent. And I want to repeat this. My sense is that we can always talk about Trump as an individual or leading the Republican. There are certain things that he can do, and there are certain things that he can't do, and we've learned that from the first regime, and now it's the second regime, and now we are wanting to sit here and imagine that he's going to do certain things and not certain things. Frankly, I think the only advantage that we have now is that, as you were saying, Samir, at least we know now it's black and white in some ways, and therefore we can consolidate certain things in the continent. We can consolidate certain things in the BRICS space. But sometimes I think our and I know it's a hegemon, but I think sometimes our obsession with the U.S. at 10 p.m. does not take the agenda forward. I would rather we spend 2 hours talking about the African agenda and what we need to do for beneficiation and for many other things instead of talking about the U.S. I think 10 minutes of the U.S. and Trump, that's fantastic. And then let's spend the next 2 hours talking about the Africa agenda.
That is my next part. Rachel, you had a reaction too? And then
but just before Rachel comes in, I love the fact that Sarah called the U.S. government regime twice. That is the way U.S. used to describe governments around the world, and today we are calling the Trump regime. I loved it, Sarah. Trump regime.
I have no objection from the chair. Rachel.
So just building on a couple of the things that Samir said, another thing that has happened, I think, with the second Trump regime is that the Republican Party is now seen as the peace party. Like, tell that to Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney in the early 2000s, that the Republican Party of today would be the ones saying, look, it's the Democrats who are hawks. It's the Democrats that are the ones that are prolonging global wars. I think that's something that's a very interesting shift that has happened. And it might be just a rhetorical shift, but it's probably a little deeper than that. The second thing I'll say is that we've had in the United States this not total, but a very clear confluence of domestic and foreign policy. I don't think Biden's MAGA was the IRA. I think Biden's MAGA was foreign policy for the middle class. And foreign policy for the middle class was revving the engine of the US manufacturing sector to counter China. And this is a continuation of Trump's China policy. Trump's China policy will then be a continuation of Biden's. But I do think that if Trump decides to approach multilateralism through the lens of great power competition, through the lens of China and Russia, that could have an opposite effect where countries that we really need to build partners with actually end up hedging against the United States. So
I'm going to follow Sarah's lead and say I would love to just continue to parse Trump and what to expect for 15 more minutes, but the second part of this panel, of the question really that I'm most interested in is the idea of multilateral reform, right? We heard about it all day long. How do you get there, and how does this election or all the others last year change it? How does it make it more likely that something's going to happen? And I say this as a 27-year veteran of Washington who started out in a world hearing about UN reforms, and I've yet to see it. So what are your goals? Is it to, BRICS is going to help offset, and the G20 is now has a chance to be broken up, and therefore one day we might change the UN Security Council and maybe get a non-voting seat. What are the goals? What are the real steps that are going to, satisfy, as Mbeke said this morning, the aspirations of the global South for that new future that you're searching for?
Look, I think the first big question, if you are South Africa, has to be, what does the Trump presidency do to South Africa's G20 presidency? Because the US joins the Troika this year. The US becomes part of the G20 process, and it would be interesting that the US under Trump, how much of a partner would it be to South Africa in terms of focusing on development, on the Global South agenda, on some key issues that Brazil, South Africa are going to put on the table. I think that's one big question which is immediate. And I think you're going to know the results soon. So in many ways, next year, we will get a sense of how the US is engaging on matters that are important to this part of the world, to this continent, and to the global South more broadly. And therefore, it is also an indication, early indication, of its intent on working within the multilateral order. So I think that's the first point. The second part, which is the structural changes, you mentioned that his defense secretary wants to bomb the UN and rebuild it. I would just caution him that if he was to bomb it...
NATO, not the UN.
NATO. NATO he can, that's not a problem. I was only worried about the UN building because
probably would like the same for the United Nations. That's probably a fair assumption.
But my point would be that it's unlikely that you are going to see too much progress on some of these more vexed multilateral questions around UN Security Council reforms or the membership, etc. And they have a life of their own. You have built a bureaucracy that thrives on no decisions. And the multilateral bureaucracy has been, in many ways, through years of training, been taught not to move the needle. And that is not necessarily a Trump question. That's a much larger effort that could either require a next big war before people wake up and decide to re-architect an institution, or some divine intervention that is going to allow leadership around the world to come up with conclusions for changing the constituency of stakeholders that are important for the multilateral. So I don't think we should necessarily count on the Trump presidency to dramatically alter what's happening in the UN-led international order. However, I think what they do at the G20 would possibly be an indication of their good faith partnership with different parts of the world, different regions of the world, on issues that are complex. Now, of course, he has a position on climate, he has a position on energy, but there are plenty of other areas where practical cooperation is possible. And we should not judge him just by one issue, where he may have a position. We should rather see it through a kaleidoscope of actions they may take across a range of different sectors and different domains that are equally important to many of us in the global South.
Sarah, I don't know if you want to respond to that, but Gladden, well, go ahead if you have an answer.
I agree. I think just to come back to this point, I mean, South Africa's economy at some point 1 week, I think recently was just tanked because there was an assumption that there was a ship somewhere in Cape Town that had an interesting cargo, right? And that was not even a Trump administration. Right. I think what was interesting for even with the election going around the U.S. around protectionism, I think for me, I think Trump might just offer us the possibility of all of us being bold enough to talk about protectionism, because Europe is talking about put Europe first, right? So Africa might even make the same argument about put Africa first, which will jeopardize the both the American economy if we were to go there. So I think there's certain things that we need to be thinking about very, very carefully around what are the opportunities for us in the global south, what are the opportunities for us in the BRICS as we move forward instead of what will Trump do, because if I was listening very carefully to Rachel, we might also be heading into interesting times where we don't know, where we wake up tomorrow and he said something else, or where we wake up, right? And instead of focusing on that volatility of the personality that is, if anything, to go by and some of the newspapers, I think we won't succeed. We'll forever, in the next 5 years, be focusing on one individual, on one space, instead of consolidating. And in that 5 years, by the way, the Sustainable Development Goals, I mean, 2030 is just around the corner. So I don't want us to just lose focus precisely because, again, the US wants to dictate the terms of where we need to be focusing.
Well, Gladden, give us your IR theory, explanation here of how Trump coming in and wanting to break the system for the purposes of America Firstism, for protectionism, whatever you might call, I assume you think is a good thing, not just for the United States or for Europe, but potentially for all these other countries that we're talking about. This idea of starting fresh, starting anew. But how much change should we really expect, given Trump's previous 4-year term and the lay of the landscape today?
This was a great conversation until you mentioned the phrase IR theory, which is like. So let's not raise it to quite that theoretical level.
I'll clarify, because in my head I thought all day long I'm hearing a lot. I know, but I'm thinking I'm hearing a lot of what I've heard in IR theory my whole life, which things as simple as the UN Security Council needs to be updated, to the modern times. Comparing that to a lot of discussions today talking about the street or the common man or lots of other phrases to how does what the people think, what MAGAism or Brexit or whatever it might be, versus what the leaders that they've elected, now they've met in the middle, what are we going to get from that?
Yeah, I only took 1 semester of IR theory and I regretted it. So I want to go back to, so I'm answering you, but I wanted to go back to what Sarah said, basically that if this is a period in which the United States will speak more clearly about its own interests, then that's also an opportunity for the rest of the world as well. I think the problem with the major multilateral institutions is that the only people who believe in the liberal internationalist ideology associated with them are the people who populate the institutions or are directly paid by them. Mm-hmm. It's not actually reflected on the level of political leadership, and so that's why I think that there's an opportunity when nations as important as the US is, whether we like it or not, are speaking in a national interest or a national sovereignty basis, that's much more honest and clear and easy to deal with than when national interest on the part of Western countries is cloaked in language that multilateral institutions put out, that's the element of dishonesty that's a part of them. The world has changed a huge amount in the last 8 years, and one element in which it's changed is that, at least on a, to throw another technical term in there, on a PPP adjusted basis, the BRICS plus countries are now equivalent or larger than the Western Bloc countries in their contribution to global GDP. So there's been a huge change in the last few years, which means that the world system is ripe for the creation of new bodies and new international formats. I think we've tossed around the term plurilateral here and there, but clearly over the last few years there's been a major change. The reaction in the West to the Russian-Ukrainian war only accelerated that. Previously, the West thought that it could turn the entire world into a liberal democracy through trade. The moment that the Russian invasion of Ukraine happened, suddenly we're back to bloc formation, decoupling. We're going to have a closed-up Western order, and, well, what did that spawn? Actually, much more competition in the rest of the world. A lot of the sanctions policies backfired. Even a lot of the US sanctions on China seem to have caused Chinese technological development in a lot of sectors to move faster. So we're in a period now where a lot of the Western powers are trying some of the techniques that they always did, but the results are backfiring or different. So the question is, just to go back to the Trump administration for a second, the question around the Trump administration is, will it become a savvy navigator of a world which it recognizes is multipolar, or will the version of America First we get become a more combative version of the same thing? So we're definitely not going to get the same neoliberal American foreign policy, but will it recognize that America has to compete for people's attention, interest, time, deals, etc., or will it be a very still kind of brandishing the stick in a harsh way? I think there are elements of both within the incoming Trump administration. So for me, that's the question to watch. But in the meantime, it's a new competition, and there's a lot of opportunity for the BRICS countries and for everyone else who is creating different plurilateral formats and new elements of exchange in the multipolar world order.
We're under 5 minutes, and I said I wouldn't wait to the end to ask questions, but I haven't seen any hands go up, so I'll make the call again. If you have a question, make your way. I see a lot now. Make your way to those microphones, and then that's how we can get you called on. I do want to ask to Rachel. We can go more. So Samir says we can go long. It's the theme of today. We can keep going. Rachel, is there a transatlantic example of the past few years that might shed light on what might be to come, given the recent history of Brexit, the blowback against Brexit, the strains on NATO and the response to Russia's invasion, the doubts of NATO's resolve, if anything more happened? Is there anything there that can shed light on what might come for the rest of the world?
Tariffs. I mean, we saw the relationship with the EU become extremely combative with the steel and aluminum tariffs, and we're already seeing discussions about what that might look like for Canada, for Mexico, for China. I also think just general rhetoric, sort of sowing doubt into the minds of allies and partners about the reliability of the United States, which in turn means the greater responsibility these states must take on themselves. I don't necessarily think that's all a bad thing.
Okay, let's see. I can see people lining up. I'll start this side, and maybe we'll go back and forth. The shorter you keep your questions, the more we can get out of them. Just introduce yourself and ask away, please.
Hi, good night. I'm Andre de Mello Souza from the Institute for Applied Economic Research in Brazil. I'd like to disagree with Samir, if I may, particularly given his blanket condemnation of multilateralism in the post-Cold War era. I think multilateralism has achieved a lot, even though clearly it is reflective of U.S. interests, and there's no denying that. But even for countries such as ours, middle-income countries, it's a lot better to face the U.S., for instance, in the umbrella of the World Trade Organization with rules and procedures that are well-defined than on a bilateral basis. This is clear. And part of the reason these institutions have ceased to function is that the global south emerged. Our countries emerged as well. We became more assertive in these multilateral institutions, and that led to deadlock. Not to mention global power transitions, but I don't want to go to IR theory, given the reaction of Gladden. So
How about a question then? Do you have a question for them?
Well, yeah, I'd just like to hear the reactions too.
Multilateralism, not so bad after all, actually. Samir?
No, look, he's making a point that you can't disagree with, but it is fundamentally misplaced. The purpose was not to lift anyone else. The purpose was to serve a narrow elite. That others could collaterally rise in that process was not the purpose of that system. And that's the point I'm trying to make. I can't disagree with the fact that people have improved their lives, but that was not the purpose of the project. So to give the project a virtue that was not in its original design as well. That's where I disagree with him. I am not disagreeing with the fact that more trade and more economic integration and more transactions help people. But the purpose of those connectivity projects and the movement of goods and the movement of financial value was to primarily serve a particular geography. And that is where I think the difference between Andre and me is. I am not disagreeing with the fact that we've lifted millions of people out of poverty. But the point, was the project designed to do that? No, because now when we have to actually help the last billion, we are struggling to put money on the table. We would rather conduct a war in Europe and use that as an excuse not to give development finance to projects that were underway in this continent itself. It tells you that priorities are misplaced. Now, Andre is in some ways right. The second part I agree with. That system was condemned by those who created it, only because the global south emerged. When we emerged, they realized, oh, someone else is making the most of the system that exists, and now we don't need to keep investing in it. So what does the US and what do their partners do? They fail the WTO. WTO is not has failed not because we rose. WTO failed because now the benefits of trade are moving to geographies and to different geographies, and it does not suit the purpose of those who came to our countries and told us, never put industrial policies. That is a bad idea. Don't have policies that privilege local manufacturing. They decided that that was no longer going to benefit them. They decided to enact those policies in their own geographies, and they condemned the WTO. So my point is not that we did not lift. Evolution means all of us will benefit over time. It does not mean that that was the purpose of the project that was put into place. So yes, there is a truism in what you say, but it is not because the project was designed to do that. It was designed to benefit some, and you had to lift others because they were going to feed into the chains that you were building to serve your mercantilist.
Okay, let's go on to over here, please.
Yes, hi, Clara. I'm from Germany, and my question is for Samir and Sarah. So you spoke of a transactionalist and unilateralist Trump presidency, and I wanted to know where you think that the global south will or should be taken other parts that are legacies of this liberal world order. So, for example, we also saw bodies of international law emerge in the 20th century, and sure enough, we've spoken, Samir, I think, has covered the restructuring of the UN, but for example, if you look at South Africa and Nicaragua bringing cases to the ICC only just very recently, that seems to suggest a continued belief in the importance of international law and a common value basis. So I would like to know what your thoughts are on where this is going to go in the future.
Okay, want to answer that one?
The world,
Briefly?
I mean, the world is not perfect. I think what Iran and South Africa are doing is just using that as an opportunity. It doesn't mean that it's perfect, and it doesn't mean that it should continue. In South Africa, we have a say that we always talk about strategy and tactic. And I think that should continue as we try to reform the world order using the same system. You can still use the token of the master to beat the master.
No, I mean, my quick response to your point is that the burden, or rather the responsibility and the imperative of actually keeping multilateralism in some form alive and kicking is now on the global south. We are contributing 60% of global growth. The largest benefits of globalization are going to accrue to countries in the southern hemisphere. So it is now incumbent upon us to invest in keeping multilateralism and some of the institutions that really matter to us alive. Now, those institutions, of course, will vary, right? They may not be the same as the ones privileged by the Atlantic system. They may be a different group of institutions that we will give priority to, right? They may not be necessarily those that are meant for purposes of influencing political outcomes in certain geographies. They may be more about the SDG agenda, more about some of the infrastructure and connectivity imperatives. That's all I'm basically. And here Andre and I will agree that globalization has to be now underwritten by countries such as South Africa, BRICS, the BRICS countries, South Africa and others who are going to benefit from it. We'll have to invest in it.
Okay, maybe we can get two more in. Let's see. Let's do again here and then over.
Ornella Cicin from Albania. So I will be very, very short. In the frame of the new regime, as you said, but US is US, what are you thinking about the Asia pivot plan? So you think that it's anymore an opportunity to build development, or to bring new reveals, or just is a zero-sum game anymore?
So I think there is more opportunity in it than we seem to think. It's not necessarily zero sum. I think we use the word pivot, and that word didn't start with the first Trump term. It's been around for a long time. I think Obama was the one that popularized it. But the reason that I think there's opportunity there is because I think it sort of will force the United States to build upon structures that are already in place. And this kind of goes back to some of the things that Kevin's been asking. I do think that the rebalance towards other geopolitical centers of gravity potentially means greater focus on multilateral institutions that have been sort of languishing. So I'm thinking in the United States, like the Development Finance Corporation, things like the Project on Global Infrastructure Investment. Those are obviously separate from this like rebalance and pivot that we talk about, but I think less of a singular focus on one region allows those potentially multilateral frameworks to flourish. And we'll just have to see, again, what happens over the next few years. There's really no telling at this point. We'll just have to wait and see.
Okay, on the side here.
Thank you very much. I think I have a problem with the organizers if they are going to tire us and leave such an important conversation towards the end of the night. But my few comments quickly, I have 3 points to make.
Very quickly, please.
Yes, one is that, by the way, I'm Kifense Kari from the OR Tambo School of Leadership. One is that, do we get any insights in terms of the political economy that involves electoral politics in democratic states from the outcomes of the US elections? And if so, what kind of frameworks are we thinking about in terms of managing the relationship that exists between corporate interests and political representatives, and what that means for democracy in as far as the will of the people is concerned? Secondly, and this is to Sarah, because he makes very interesting points about the need to focus on ourselves. Do we have the capacity as the Global South to build institutions that will hold particular players, especially in the Global North, when they renegade on their own commitments? For example, the Trump administration comes with a very overt renegation from climate action commitments. What does that mean for the Global South, and how is the Global South going to hold that administration accountable for that particular renegation, because it has serious implications? And lastly, how long will we keep screaming and kicking about reform? What is our threshold on saying we'll get to a point where if this reform doesn't work, we'll build our own capacity to build our own institution that will provide alternatives? Because you can't keep saying, I want to reform the United Nations Security Council forever and ever. What if that reform doesn't come? What is our option as the Global South? Thank you very much.
Good set of questions. Sarah, you want to take on?
Let me just take the comment, and thanks for the questions, and I'll be brief. I've seen other people want to say something. First is that this discussion around democracy and American democracy, and we're not talking about the fact that in South Africa we've just had elections. We have not spoken about that, and what does it mean for our development in the continent as a powerhouse in the continent. India also had its own elections. What does it mean, right? And if we want to tend these conversations around democracy, then we need to be focusing there as well. And by the way, this notion of pivot, and you know, it has a particular definition in the U.S. vis-a-vis what it could mean, and it has always meant in the African continent. I would, you know, colonialism and many other forms of slavery in the African continent has been moments of pivoting, as they say. Capacity, I don't think that when you are in, and I almost said in war, but when you are in a transformative moment, you need to be asking yourself whether you have capacity or not. You are in it, whether you like it or not, and therefore the question should not be whether we have capacity or not, but rather whether we have the will to change some of these institutions. The fact of the matter is the world never ever imagined that today, 2024, we will have something called the New Development Bank. So, and if we had to go back and ask ourselves whether we had the capacity or not, we would not have had the imagination to have the bank or even set it up. So I think it is important again to use those examples as potential for, as they say, pivoting differently.
We're nearing an hour on our panel, so I'll defer to you, to Samir, but if we want to get these last two, I'll take them in together and give everyone a last chance to answer or make final remarks, if that's a good format for you.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
let's just take them together and make notes.
Then
and
actually, I apologize. I know there's lots of people online, but we only have time for, we'll do the first at the microphone. We'll get their questions in together, and then we'll answer. So you can lightning round them. Yes.
So thank you so much. Can I ask a question to Rachel? Yes, my name is Alexander Loshin. I'm from Russia, Primakov Institute of World Economy and International Relations. So I have an obvious question. We know that Trump wants a deal on Ukraine, so we all really want to end this conflict, and I hope on deal, but really honestly, I don't believe in deal. At the same time, we see that Trump can make a more assertive policy toward Europe and towards taxes, trade, and towards NATO, and I'm afraid that it can lead to more thought, even fierce policy of European Union and the UK towards Russia, first of all, but also towards other countries.
Your question? You have to give us a question.
So what do you think? Is it possible that European Union will become more assertive toward Russia and China and North Africa and so on?
This is the only conference I've attended in several years, but at 11 p.m., 8 people have lined up to ask questions. So all kudos to you, Samir, and the team, which is fantastic. I think there are more people asking questions at 11 p.m. than 11 a.m. So it's quite a brilliant situation.
Well, I'll take them all if we can get through them quickly.
So I'll come back to you. There is a region in the world where there is social strife, riots in the cities, there's a war zone, political instability, governments are falling, people don't know who is going to be the next PM, and that region is not in Asia or Africa, it's in Europe, right? So is this, the question to you, and maybe Sarah, Gladden, Rachel, and Samir, how can Asia and Africa benefit from the weakening of Europe? Because I see this as the beginning of the end of Europe as we know it.
Ooh, that's a good song lyric then. All right, keep it going, quick.
Good evening. I'm a former member of the European Parliament, and I'm a politician. So I just want to say in the first person that I very much agree with the Samir analysis, because we face this year a big year of elections, even in Europe. And talking about sudden changes, and I'm always seeing people criticizing Trump, but I want to remind you, when Macron says that NATO was in dead cerebral.
Brain dead, yes.
Yes, and also Biden took almost 3 years to try to make a decision about the use of long-range weapons. So this is about predictability. And for finishing, I think we need more action and less poetical and beautiful speeches. Being me, a politician, I can assure you that people in Europe, and there is also another European here, that could agree with me, because people are very stuck of beautiful and poetical speeches. We need more action. It's just this.
That's a statement. Okay, we'll go back left to left and right, and we're through for the night. Go ahead.
My question is to do with the responsibilities of the Global South and institutions that reaffirm and affirm those responsibilities. What institution do you think the Global South should launch to announce its willingness to take on the global responsibilities, as well as in perks of international places such as joining the Security Council and such?
And your name, sir?
Sviatoslav Yurash, Ukraine's youngest member of parliament.
And our final questioner of the night. Make it good.
Okay, Sutikon from Thailand. So we have seen that, many discussions about multipolarity worlds. We discussing about different institutions like BRICS, like G20, regarding them to be the one that helping the world to be multipolar. But now, I think what we are seeing now is like we are making US less dominating force in the world, right? But maybe in that sense, we give away to the new dominating force by sheer size. For example, China, in 15 years, in 20 years, there will be the largest economy in the world. And we give one country less dominating by saying that this is institution to make a multipolar world. But eventually, there will be new giant coming into town. So how can these multipolar mechanisms or institutions make sure that we maintain this multipolarity world? Thank you.
Okay, an excellent series of final questions this late in the evening. I think the wine may have helped loosen lips in the audience. So please wrap us up, and I'll just let's go down the line. You can answer any or all of those questions and make your final thoughts.
So I'll do the Republican thing. I'll give you the bumper sticker response to every question. One, do we have the capacity to effect change? I don't think capacity is important. Do we have the hunger and the intent to seize this moment to build new alternatives? And I think that's the question. Does the Global South have the hunger and the intention and the leadership to seize this moment? Lessons from democracy, very important question. Lessons from democracy, I think there's one common trend. Leaders should listen to those on the streets. Those who did not listen have lost. Please pay attention to those who vote for you. You do not work for the Ivy League college graduates alone. You work for your country, listen to your countrymen. And I think that's the lesson across democracies this time, whether it's Europe, whether it's America, whether it's Asia. Beginning of the end of Europe, look, I disagree with that. I disagree with that because I think Europe as a geography and Europe as people are not going anywhere. They are only going to reorganize, and they are going to, in some ways, re-engage with the world in a format that suits their interest. Are we going to see the beginnings of a real Europe? I hope so. Till now, Europe was only poetry, as someone just described. It was all poetry and very little substance. We might see a more substantive Europe emerge in the coming 4 or 5 years, and I think that's the change on Europe. The responsibilities of the Global South, great question. We have been free riders. As my friend Andre mentioned, that because the system wasn't designed for us, we picked up whatever we could without having to pay for anything. So we were free riders in a system that wasn't meant to benefit us, but we were able to nibble at the edges and take away whatever we could for free. Now, if we want the system to work for us, we will have to bear responsibility. And I think the single biggest responsibility, and I think the MBK Foundation is doing a remarkable job, and many others as well, we have to take the responsibility of reclaiming peace. Global peace and stability is not a Western ideal or a Western project. I think more actors from this part of the world have to now reclaim that initiative and strive for stability and peace, because it is in our interest if we flourish as economic partners and as economic engagements. Last point on hegemony, I think that's my friend from Thailand, Sutikon. What happens when China becomes the new US and there is Chinese hegemony? I think we will need a new BRICS. Like BRICS was designed to oppose American hegemony in the first decade. You will have a new BRICS that will be created to oppose Chinese hegemony. I think this is the cycle of life. In some sense, a hegemon will arrive, others will, you need checks and balances. But truly, I think in this multipolar moment, it will require really significant and differentiated growth in Beijing for Beijing to emerge as a hegemon. I think the chances that it is going to be the largest economy of the world are itself under question. I think that is not a certainty. And the fact that US decline is such an easy assumption is also false. US is not going anywhere. I think it is going to remain the preeminent economic power for a very long time to come. And in many ways, the rise of China, of Brazil, of South Africa, of India and others is going to create a more fair and just world.
You don't think the U.S. is going to replace China in the BRICS group?
Then it would become singular. It will become a BRICS.
There you go. No, but I mean, I think you're totally right. And our friend here, who is the member of European Parliament, the people that are saying, well, what happened with this Trump win? We don't get it. It's like you're spending too much time in Washington, I think. And so there's a lot to unpack there. But in terms of the European Union, I think the way that it becomes more assertive is how and if it can figure out a way to project power effectively in the next 5 to 10 years. And the EU always considers itself a normative power of shared values, and we see those values sort of dividing at this point. So if the EU can project power around those in a way, I think it actually makes it a much more powerful actor. But again, this is like wishful thinking because it's always been so difficult, and it's going to take, I think, a push from the United States. Russia, Ukraine. Trump just named Keith Kellogg the special envoy for Ukraine today. Go read his stuff. He has a piece in National Interest with Dan Negrea talking about an escalate to de-escalate strategy in terms of a potential ceasefire. I don't actually think Trump is going to be as bad for Ukraine as people think he might be, because I don't think he wants to start off his presidency with his own version of Biden's Afghanistan withdrawal. I think that's an unnuanced comparison, but it's one I think that you can sort of make and that people are making to him. And so I think the sticking point, and this is always going to be the sticking point, is NATO membership. And I don't know where we go from there. I think that's where we're going to have to see how many months and potentially years of negotiations look like.
Well, I'm not going to try to answer all the questions, but I wanted to come back briefly to the discussion about multilateral institutions to say that I think the main problem with them is not whether they have been effective in this way or that way, but the main problem afflicting multilateral institutions today is their ideology, because the ideology has slowly taken over and caused a kind of mission creep, and that's distorting our perception of their effectiveness or influence. For example, let's take the European Union, of which Hungary is a member. Well, the European Union has a great policy in it. It's called, again, not to throw out another technical term late at night, it's called the cohesion policy, so that countries from Central and Eastern Europe that were economically disadvantaged, particularly under the Soviet Union, would be able to catch up through transfers of money from Brussels. But this has now, at least from a Hungarian perspective, become an ideological weapon, and the normative, quote-unquote, shared values that the European Union supposedly represents have now been used against us in order to make life more difficult for Hungary on a political basis. So it's taking something that's a good policy from a mechanical standpoint, and the ideology has transformed it and made it excessive. So there very well could be all sorts of interesting formats in the upcoming years. For example, do we really want to see the trade imbalances that occur throughout the world be addressed through conflicting tariff policies? No. Once upon a time, there was the Bretton Woods arrangement, which was a kind of international system, which was intended to provide a framework through which persistent trade imbalances and other things could be worked out. So maybe there's room for speculation in that area, and it could come from anywhere. So anyway, we'll see. Certainly Europe needs a wake-up call. It needs some harsh medicine, but whether, I think the two options that we'll see are, number one, the instinct of the US is to drag Europe once again into all of its own preferred conflicts. If we see that, then Europe won't be a very good competitor in the multipolar world because it won't be able to articulate its own interests. And the other one, the US focuses more on itself and says, well, Europe, if you need more formats of interaction with the BRICS and the Global South and China and Russia as well. Go ahead, figure it out, take care of yourself, do what's best for you. I think in that situation, we would find the potential for Europe to be truly strong, but it will be in a quite different way from the way that the transatlantic alliance is currently perceived.
Thanks. I must say it's very refreshing to have politicians in the room that don't believe in rhetoric but action. 3 things from my side very quickly. I think we need to continue expanding BRICS to avoid the pitfalls of a new political giant that overwhelms all of us. I think for Africa, I think we need to continue building on the Africa Union so that we continue with the message that Africa is not for sale and that we are not here for handouts. Lastly, number 3, that I know that a fair and just world is indeed possible. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. In my final thought as host privilege is, you know, when Joe Biden was elected that first year, I interviewed Jake Sullivan, and you can find this online, and I asked him directly, you know, coming out of the last 4 years of the Trump administration and the Brexit era and hearing the populist calls around the world, is this a moment to remake the world? You know, Joe Biden truly is the last president of the 20th century. Somebody mentioned Bretton Woods. He may have been there. He's you know, is there a new Bretton Woods? Is there a new United Nations, a new system that the United States might be the one to lead to help bring up the global South or to create new equity, something? And the answer was no. That's not our agenda. We don't think the entire world needs to be broken to be rebuilt. We want to work within the system that has gotten the United States to where it was. 4 years later, Joe Biden lost. And what we're seeing are new voices coming in and everything that you share with us this evening. So I leave that thought on the table that there was and now at the last election, more and more votes have been counted, and I think we're down to about a 1.5% difference in the popular vote between Kamala Harris and President Trump, which means that it's only 1.5% difference of us having a whole different conversation here this year, next year, or 4 years from now, where nothing changes because the system is benefiting those who think that it's benefiting them in the way that they need to. Thank you all for your perspectives. Thank you for your questions from the audience this evening, and to the Mbeki Foundation and ORF for having us all.